here in just a minute. So good afternoon and welcome everybody to another one of our Jane webinar training series. And today we're going to talk about photography, and we're going to talk about both agricultural and landscape photography. And let me tell you the reason why I think this is so important. You know, today in all the digital media that's out there that's free to use or somewhat free to use, images are capturing the attention of people more than ever. And when you think about our industry, ag and landscape, we have the ability to show images so much better than others, right? I always think if I was stuck in an accounting firm, how would I use photography to show the work I do? So fortunately, we're in an industry where photography works and really gives you the opportunity to show you some of your best work. So one thing I've learned as I've traveled around is a lot of people don't have a lot of good photography of their jobs or the things that they're working on. In fact, our presenter today, Michael, and I were at a specifier's office a few years ago, and he was telling us about all these projects he was really happy about, proud of, which he should have been. They were really amazing projects. And we said, hey, do you have some photos of it? And he didn't. And I know Michael went out and helped him out with that and got some photos, and they built a good relationship with that. So you can see, again, the power of the photography and good shots. So. Today, we're really fortunate to have Michael Derwenko presenting and teaching us about photography today. Michael's been at Jane for over 5 years now with me. We worked together at Valley Crest before then. But prior to his irrigation work for a while, Michael worked as a professional photographer. And he's also a landscape contractor too, so quite a diverse background. But I've been so impressed with his photography for years, and every time I'm around him, I'm always hitting him up for tips and ways to help myself, to be a better photographer, because it works so well with our industry. So we're really lucky to have Michael teaching us. I've seen some presentations he's done before, and we're in for a real treat. I also know that at the end of the presentation, Michael's got a great contest for us, and it has to do with taking photographs. So I'll not spoil it for him, but I just want to mention he'll be talking about that at the end as well. And of course, you can always check in on the Q&A or in the chat. If you have questions, you can put them there, and I'll be sure to ask them for you. So with that, Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hopefully, we learned some things today.
I'm confident of that.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how we're going to teach you everything you need to know about photography in 30 minutes.
Well, we sometimes make up with it with enthusiasm.
Right. That's what I'm full of today. All right. Well, thank you, Richard. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I have a pretty unique background coming from landscape contracting and irrigation while shooting photos since I was about 12, 13 years old. So I've been shooting photos a long time. And initially, before I shot photos of landscaping, I shot photos of action sports, skateboarding, professional skateboarders. And so I got really used to laying on the ground and freezing action, whether or not it be skateboarders or water. And so it's kind of, sculpted my career into what it is now with marketing at Jane. And so hopefully we can go over some tips. As you mentioned, I think being able to shoot photos is a great resource and a great talent for everybody on this webinar today, from contractors, specifiers, everybody. There's always visual appeal in whatever we're working on, and a photo is usually the easiest way to do it. So hopefully you learned some basics. And if you have any questions, Richard, just let me know. I'll try to go through it with a pretty solid cadence. One of the things I like to open up with is this gloomy photo from a golf course. It doesn't maybe fall into the agriculture or landscape category, but what I do think it shows is a lot of the times right now we're shooting digital. So we're shooting what we call, you're shooting kind of for post. You plan on bringing the image into a computer or some form of editing software to get a final product. And a photo like this, maybe we start cleaning up the grass, or look at the sky is as white as the border. And so by the time we're done, we've layered, anywhere from 8 to 10 images on top. We've added sky, and then this is the final outcome. So if you take into account when you're shooting images these days, that you're going to pull it in and that you have the potential to add all these, these beautiful things on the post side, it helps you when you're shooting through the camera, because I think for so many years we came through, once it was on film, there was really nothing left you could do with it. And so whatever was in the camera was kind of the final say. So you had to get really good at shooting photos for real, as opposed to now where we can take them in and we can make great amendments to images and make them burst in something like this.
So Michael, one thing that's really interesting to me is one thing you've taught me too is that the prep before is so important, right? And I've, this photo behind me that I'm using for my wallpaper is one of your shots too. And I always learn from you that preparing the area is more important than actually taking the shot. But there, you did quite a few add-ins, right, with your editing. Are you going to talk about editing software later, or?
Yeah, so I'm going to cover everything it takes to go from this photo to this photo, hopefully. So I'll try to cover everything, and you'll see that the editing software is one component of it. A lot of the times we forget that in the grand scheme of things, it's also who your audience is, who you're trying to appeal to. So in this particular case, we have the sprinklers running. So obviously this was for a sprinkler manufacturer. But at the same time, we want to make sure the customer, the golf course superintendent, feels some confirmation that they're doing the right thing and that their site looks the best it can. So in this particular case, maybe it's raking grass out of the way or, weed whacking around the lake. So there's always some variables that, the more you can control, the more consistency you can provide on a production or a shoot, the better outcome you have. And, to your point of the one behind you, that's a controlled circumstance that we're going to talk about here in a second.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, I got my start shooting people flying through air before I shot water flying through air. And, it taught me a lot about lighting and how to freeze things. A lot of photography, if not all of photography, is lighting, and how to use lighting to the best of our, the best opportunity possible in every setting. And so these are one of the more difficult things to shoot. And some of these photos, we have anywhere from 9 to 10 different strobe flashes surrounding these guys as they're doing tricks that take a split second. So to me, it was very advanced. I know a lot of photographers that have come out of the skateboard or surf or action sports and moved on to things like what we do, because it's really fun and interesting. And then, as I mentioned, I got really good at laying on the ground too. So some of the basics, if nobody on the call right now knows anything about shooting photos, I wanted to just cover some basics. These are some terminologies we hear a lot when we're talking about photography. And the easiest way to wrap your head around it is there's really only 2 or 3 major variables or major settings that you need to know about. And yeah, cameras can automatically do this, but what tends to happen when you use automatic settings in a camera is the camera doesn't really know what the message or the story you're trying to tell with the subject matter and with the framing and with the image. And so, yeah, it might give you the settings you want and the exposures you want, but it ultimately doesn't create the lines or create the composition of the image, which is what you're going for. So the camera can only help you so much. So the key to knowing, these auto settings that it's thrown at you is to know what exactly they're doing. And I have explained it enough times in my life that I try to simplify it. And so here's a couple tips that I have. And if you have any questions, let us know. But these are the 3 main setting variables that are important when shooting something, manually. And it's the aperture, the shutter speed, and the film speed. Combined, these 3 things are what basically produces our image. The aperture is the first one. I've been watching James Bond since I was 5 years old. And the best example I can give is the beginning of every James Bond. And those leafs, the way that they close, the size of the hole that they leave open is our aperture. And that's what controls the clarity or the depth of field and our focal planes in the image. If we have someone in the foreground, in the middle ground, or in the background, this is how we decide what we want to be the main component of our image. And the aperture is what helps us do that. So smaller the hole you get, the tighter everything's going to look. And so if you work off of your aperture, that's where you're actually really starting to develop. That's where photography really gets fun.
So Michael, I have a question. Yeah, we have a question here. So if I'm using, help me understand the difference between aperture and focus, right? Because sometimes when I'm focusing, I can zoom in or zoom out. Am I actually increasing or reducing the aperture when I do that? Or is this two different things? What's the difference?
So remember, when you're zooming with a lens, you can also walk forward and backwards typically. So if you're walking closer to your subject and you zoom in and then you tighten up your aperture, now you're going to take the foreground subject matter and you're really going to drop out the background and make it blurry. So it's a combination of focusing on your subject and then also using the aperture and your distance to the subject to actually bring them either forward or backwards in the composition of the image. So it's the combination of the two. I always think that's funny when people stand still and they zoom in and out on a lens and they don't move at all. The whole idea of a zoom lens is that you can still move forward or backwards. And as you do that, you adjust your aperture, and then that's what gives you that depth of field that you're looking for the composition. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So okay. And then, if I'm using the f1.4,
Yeah.
I'm actually going to have more in my image. So like if I was filming a garden, I wouldn't necessarily shoot just a one flower with that. I might shoot many plants.
Right. It's going to be a very flat image. You're not going to really have much context or much depth where, yeah, it's just going to be very flat. The main reason people want a very low aperture is mostly for light exposure. The main cameras, the reason they got super expensive was because the sensors could shoot in very low light. And so the lower the aperture, the more you're opening up the shutter or the aperture, excuse me, the F. And so by doing that, you're allowing more light in. And so now everyone's kind of racing to the bottom to get these sensorless cameras, and what they do is they allow you to shoot in really low light. So you're not really benefiting from low aperture because of the focal plane, in my opinion, but you're doing it because you can shoot in really low light.
Okay, great. And then somebody was asking to give an example of walking into a shot and changing the f-stop.
Well, the best example I can give, and I'll show you guys, and you'll see in a second, but basically when you're shooting portraits or you're shooting a person, it's the easiest way to explain it. A lot of people, for instance, a lot of corporate profile photos now are shot with a very tight aperture. They just blur out the background and the person in the foreground. And it kind of gives it like that nice even light in the background, but you can't really see any detail to things. That's a good example of using the aperture to your advantage to control the focal plane. If you do what you were saying and you shoot a really low one, the background and the foreground, everything's going to be in focus, and you're really contextually, you're not like drawing anyone's attention to anything in particular. And so the easiest way to explain it is, when you have, and Apple's monopolized on this now with their portrait mode, which basically just does that for people. And it's in so many words, it's forcing people to become better photographers because they're not shooting everything in focus. They're forced to move back 4 feet or move forward 3 feet. And what it's trying to tell you is that, use the camera and your proximity to your subject matter to get that depth of field that you want.
Yeah, no, exactly what I was going to say, like portrait mode on my iPhone.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple slides in the end for iPhone stuff, and it talks about that. But technology has come a long way.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
One of the other settings we want to keep an eye on besides aperture is our shutter speed. And this one, especially with skating and shooting water, is a huge one. This is how fast those leaves actually contract and allow the light to pass in and hit the sensor. So the aperture is the size of the hole, and the shutter speed is how fast the leaves actually make it down to that size hole to allow light to pass in. And as you can see, when we're freezing water, we use a very high shutter speed. Usually something like this is over 250th of a second. I know in the grand scheme of things, we can shoot 10,000th of a second now, but typically 250 is pretty fast. We lose our flash sync at about 200 to 220, which means you can only use flashes with the camera at a certain high shutter speed because you're moving faster than the speed of light. So the sensor can't even catch up to catch the lights. So at 250th of a second in the middle of the day, this is how we're going to freeze water. Shooting any more than that, it's unnecessary. And that's another thing you'll learn about photography is there's an efficiency to it. Yes, you can shoot everything the largest format possible. You can shoot everything as fast as possible. But once you pull it into post or into a computer, you find it that you're putting it into the medium that you need. it's just wasted work. And so there's an efficiency to it. And so what we do is we shoot just the size image we need at the shutter we want. So nothing is more complicated than it needs to be. And on this, on the left side, you'll see this is an example of a slower shutter speed where we're allowing the leaves to take their time to close. And in doing so, they're showing the water's movement like that. It's actually a major faux pas in photography, but people seem to love the effect.
So yeah, and the other one, we can definitely see, you know, the individual drops of water coming out of the sprinklers from a pretty good distance away.
Yeah, and so everything's pretty much in focus there. The corn in the foreground is in focus. The sprinklers are in focus. The windmill's in focus. I think that's a combination of a couple images. I don't think that corn was the same photo. So we combined some of the images. But, you know, if we had zoomed in on the sprinklers, then the corn in the foreground would be more blurry, and then the background would be more blurry. And then that would be a way that we would be using our aperture or our depth of field. That's not a good representation of depth of field. That's what we talked about earlier. That's a very flat image. But for, you know, what we're talking about, it has everything in focus. So this one, it was always the most confusing to me, or I think it's the most confusing to modern day photographers that have picked up photography in the technology age. Back when, you know, some of us started shooting, we used film. Well, you learned a lot about how much light the film could take, or you learned a lot about like light speed or ISO as we call it. But basically the easiest way to explain it, or I've always thought, is like a sponge. And I shot a lot of 3200 speed black and white in low light circumstances for skate contests and stuff. And we had to shoot sequences, which means we shot 8 to 10 frames a second. So we needed any available light to hit the film and stick to the film. So it would actually, so we could, excuse me, what's the term? When we go into the lab and process it. So when we process it, and so I got really used to knowing, well, 100 speed film is going to be really crisp. It's going to be, you're not going to have a lot of available light. So you've got to provide a lot of your own light, but you're going to get that crispness that you want. So if you have the stability of a tripod for long exposures, like in something like this, or you're in the middle of the day and you have plenty of available light, you can go with a lower ISO. If you don't have a lot of available light, you're going to go with a higher speed film. Why does this matter now? This goes back to what I was saying, is a lot of the mirrorless cameras that are out now, it's a race to who can shoot the highest quality image in a low light scenario. And essentially what they're doing is they're trying to do what happened here with film, is they're trying to get that clarity out of a high speed ISO film.
So I don't have, this is a question, I don't have a film speed anymore on my camera, right? It's a digital camera.
Oh, you do? It's just
I do, and I have an ISO that I still set.
Yeah, it's one of the automatic settings on a camera. So it's usually not one, like as you're pushing the shutter halfway down, it's changing. You're going to set it, or it's going to automatically set on the back end. But there's definitely still an ISO and a film speed, because as we'll talk about in a second, when I shoot product photography inside in a controlled circumstance with an extreme amount of light, I want the lowest ISO possible. We shoot at about 100, sometimes 60, because that way we get that product like clarity. That's where everything looks really crisp, but it requires a lot of even artificial light.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was explaining to a young person the other day about how I used to take my film to a photomat, which was a little box in the parking lot of the grocery store, and hand it out my car window and come back and get it in 5 days. I had my pictures. They thought I was pulling their leg.
I mean, I've spent a week on one photo before, just between processing and working in the lab on it. I mean, it's come a long way where we can do this in Photoshop a lot easier than we used to.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Another question I get a lot is when, you know, well, why can't I just use my iPhone or my smartphone for everything that I shoot? Well, the bottom line is I know they look great on phones and on computers, but when it comes to printing, you know, we need really, really high quality images, usually about 10 times as close to anything that's going to come off of a smartphone. So for social media and for website work, iPhones work great. But for billboards, for posters, anything bigger than, I usually say about maybe a little bit bigger than 8 by 10, 11 by 17, you're not going to get a good quality image out of an iPhone. It's not going to be as crisp as an SLR. And excuse me, the term SLR, as you'll see here, is it's a single lens reflex. And so what that means is the image that you're shooting goes through that lens, and it hits a mirror and it bounces off the mirror and then it goes onto the sensor. That's how we're able to see the image, and it reverses itself and it ends up on the sensor plane the way we want it. Well, that's what they've eliminated now, is that mirror. And so mirrorless cameras don't have that mirror. So you're kind of getting first generation, an image. You're not bouncing it off of something. And so that's where you get clarity. And that's where the hype behind a mirrorless camera comes from, because I get that question a lot as well. I'm a little old school. I like an SLR, the mirrorless technology. I think the cameras are still a little, they kind of focus on video a little bit more than shooting photos. So I still tend to lean to a standard SLR.
So, Michael, we have a couple of questions here from our audience. And are you going to review proper framing of a subject to get the best picture possible?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we also have one about aerial photography. Do you use a drone ever? Do you shoot drone photos? And what kind of camera do you use with that?
So as you saw in this image here, when we filmed this video, we used a 3-man drone. And so I don't personally fly drones. Depending on the production, we'll use 1-man, 2-man, and 3-man drones. The reason we want multiple people running our drones is because you have a pilot that flies the drones, and then you have multiple cameramen. And so on something like this, we have 2 cameras on the bottom of the drone, and then each one has an independent cameraman. And so they're able to turn it as the pilot flies. And so as soon as you see that in movies, when you see the camera move across the water, it's not just one drone flying. It's usually a drone flying sideways, and then the camera is panning. And the combination of those 2 movements is what gives it that intriguing effect. So on this one in particular, these Genesis sprinklers in Nebraska, we used a 3-man drone, and we're out there all morning and got some beautiful shots. One of the biggest hurdles that we have with drones is, I never thought this would be a problem, is the water gets on the lenses. So we're constantly having to land the drone to clean the water off. So on this particular day, I want them to get as close as possible, but every time they get really close, the water sprays on the lens and they have to land it and clean the drone. So we have random little production issues like that I never would have expected, but that's about the extent of my drone work.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
So some lighting tips. As I mentioned, lighting is very crucial, and natural light is obviously the best thing to shoot in. We actually will mimic it with scrims and reflectors to try to use any opportunity for natural light over artificial light. Blending artificial light and natural light it can be quite complicated and a cumbersome process. So anytime we can take advantage of the available light, we want to. As you can see in these, and that top right one is actually a really good use of a focal plane. You can see the depth of field there, how the back is blurred out, how there's a foreground blurred out, and the middle ground is in focus. So that's a good use of a tight focal plane. And it tells a story. You see the worker in the background, you see the plants in the foreground, and ultimately that's what you're trying to do with these images, is you're trying to tell a story. And if somebody can't look at it and figure out what the photographer's trying to do, then you're just shooting for yourself, which is obviously what we're trying to get past. So and so these are all great examples of available light, and there's some good lineage with the corns and the corn lines and stuff like that too.
Yeah, so a question here, Michael. This picture on the bottom right of the family, that is definitely a shot in which almost everything is in focus, yet it has depth. It's not flat like the corn in the slide before.
Yeah.
So how did you get that depth? I mean, this is the secret that every photographer wants to know. How do I get that depth in my pictures when I want everything in focus?
Well, so if you look at the one consistent variable between the 2 images on the right is the light source. See how the light's coming from behind the background? So anytime you can use the light to blur out or, it looks like everything's in focus in that bottom one, but I can tell you it's not. That sunrise and that horizon, or that sunset and that horizon, is out of focus. If anything, I went in and sharpened it up so you could see it a little bit better, just because, as you can see in the top image, once again, the story of how blurry do you want it? I didn't want the sunset and the horizon to be so blurred out that you couldn't really tell what it was. And so sometimes we'll go in and just kind of rework it like that. But it's probably a little flatter than it needs to be. But once again, you're trying to show that they're looking at a sunset. And so if they were too out of focus, then it would just look like a light source and you wouldn't be able to tell what was going on.
Yeah. Okay.
that's what I was thinking. I think I was
right. So when you say you sharpen it up and you sharpen it up and you're at
a child not turning around and looking at the camera constantly. Because I was up on a ladder and he couldn't help but keep looking back at me. And I was just like, look at the sunset. Here's another one. Yeah. So good natural light. We drop it out a little here. The good thing with natural light, and one of the challenges is obviously weather. Clouds can create what we call God light or dream light towards the end of the day, where you get these great contrasting lights and polarizing lights that come through the clouds, especially the lower clouds like here. And so anytime someone once told me, a professor said, when you go and shoot photos and you go all the way to Europe, don't shoot photos all day. Go to museums in the afternoon, shoot photos in the morning, and shoot photos at sunset. And during the day, the light is too flat. The shadows are too harsh. The lights are too contrasting. That is not the time to go shooting photos. This is the time. And so, as you mentioned earlier, knowing when to go shoot what you're trying to shoot and the story you're trying to tell are way more important than knowing shutter speed and aperture. You'll figure that out pretty quickly. And so that's why I think a lot of the subject matter in these is crucial, because it's telling a story. You can tell exactly what's going on. You can tell the season. And that's why I use these images as an example. But growing up in Florida and shooting, we learned a lot about 2 o'clock thunderstorms. But as soon as the thunderstorms pass, you get great end-of-day light. And so you got to try to use that whenever you can.
So Michael, a lot of people have issues with sun glare also. Do you use filters for that? Should I worry about a filter like on my iPhone? What about that?
So if you use a good iPhone's different. On an SLR, on a lensed camera, or like a bayonet camera, you can put a polarizing filter on the end. I grew up using polarizing filters. With post now, you don't really need to do that. The effect that a polarizing filter is going to have, any image you bring into some form of editing software, you're going to be able to add that effect, turn it on and off. You're going to mess with it anyways. So I don't really waste my time with the polarizer. I use a clear filter on the end of my camera just because it gets wet all the time. So that's the only reason I even have anything on the end of it. But if you've got a good glass lens, you shouldn't get glare unless you're shooting right at it, or if your light source is raking across the front of your lens. Then you just have to alter your position. I mean, you're never cemented down. I can't stress enough. And I'm going to talk about it here in a second, but bending your knees and moving your body and your torso sometimes is the best way to make a photo better. It doesn't have anything to do with the equipment. So, so sometimes take a step closer. It helps.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
And as you can see, so this is a typical set. That photo behind you was one of these days where we were shooting, and you can see there's no artificial light. There's no flashes at all. We're using available light. We're shooting from 10 o'clock in the morning till about 4 o'clock, and because we're shooting midday, we've got to do something to control the light. So we use big 8-foot scrims, and that filters down the light, gives us an even light, and that allows us to really focus on these little sets that we build for the irrigation products. And now I know that looked like a big production, but they do make breakaway reflectors that fold down into like a 12-inch circumference or diameter. And you can bring those. I would tell photographers to bring that instead of a flash any day. If you can wait to shoot the photo in the middle of the day and use some reflective light and get your subject matter to stand in a shadow, your image is going to look way better than if you have a flash where everything tends to be much flatter. And so I've been known to just give reflectors out to people on the road because it's a $25 device that will completely transform your photos if used properly. And as you can see in this, I mean, it probably looks like it's in the field or on a site. It's not. It's on a table. And two, you can see how crisp everything is and how even the lighting is. Nothing's blown out. There's nothing harsh. And we were able to do that with available light and just some scrimming and reflecting.
And you just revealed the secret of my wallpaper.
Secret of your wallpaper. Yeah. I mean, it's all really fascinating growing up building skate spots, and we had to kind of create our own spots for our photos. It's very similar to what we do. Sometimes this goes back to the efficiency and the production factor for the contractors out there. You find the site that looks the best, and then you shoot every aspect of it instead of going to 20 of your sites. So that's where the efficiency comes in. And we can build 20 sets in 5 days. That's way easier and cheaper than traveling to 20 different sites. And so, knowing your audience, knowing what they want to see the product, they want to see it, in action, like here, they want to see it working and how the technology works. So that's the story we're trying to tell from a manufacturer's perspective. As I mentioned, artificial light, one of the main reasons we do use artificial light is for our product photos. These are shot in studios, but we're shooting these at a very high aperture because we want everything to be in focus and we want it to be as crisp as possible. So we're filtering, we're scrimming our artificial light. And as you can see, so you see good dark tones and good colors and everything like that. As you mentioned at the beginning, I can't tell you how many companies over the years or how many friends I've shot products or their product photos of, and that's led to like direct sales because now customers have the visual of exactly what they're buying. It works way better than a bad photo. Not to mention, I think it kind of speaks to the quality of the product you're trying to market or sell, the quality of the image. And so these are really easy tips to make your images look the best possible. So you mentioned earlier framing and the easiest way to frame your subject in an image. And this is a contested topic, but I personally have been told and taught never to put subjects in the middle of an image, never to frame them directly center. So I work on the rule of fours, where you now have 4 squares within your rectangle, or when I shoot a medium format, it's a square, or rectangle on the right, you can see same kind of thing. But my buddy Ricky here that's skating, you can see he's in the top right as opposed to being dead center. We use the railway to kind of work your eye down towards where he's going to land. So, there's lineage to it. And so what you're trying to do is you're ultimately trying to pull their attention from one corner to the other. And most people, obviously, if you don't skate, you have no idea where he's about to land or where he's coming from. But as a skateboarder, you're going from right to left, you're going over something, and you can see, you always want to show where they're taking off from and where they're landing. And the same thing is true with what we shoot in landscaping. You want to see the whole sprinkler, you want to see the whole trajectory of the water, as you saw in the previous images. And, and then you want to see some context to where the actual product is, or where the landscaping or the irrigation product is. And so all those things come into play. And, that's one of the things that's really neat about what we get to shoot is some of these beautiful sites. And, but ideally I'm trying to market our product. And so that's why I want our product to look the best possible.
So there's 200 of us on this call that want to know, did he land that?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. So as you can see here, same thing. So in the bottom left, we have some good lines. There's good contrasting colors. You spoke about the glare earlier. Sometimes you can use glare to your advantage. And they do make filters like sunburst filters that you see that people use at night all the time. That they create this effect. So there was a polarizing lens of some aspect here to give that effect. But once again, a lot of crispness in the foreground, and then it drops out in the background. But, also one of the things you shoot for when you shoot for post is, I'm pretty sure we use this for this was shot for a promotion. And so we wanted to put titling in the top left where the sky is. So a lot of times when you're shooting for post, if you're, an architect or contractor that's shooting for your website, don't shoot vertical images because how a website's laid out. It's usually laid out long ways or horizontal. And then also give yourself some room to put text over or to put an image over. Take that into account when you're out shooting, or if anything, shoot horizontal and vertical for the different applications. But that goes back to my previous point of always knowing ultimately where your image is going to end up. Ideally, I'm not really shooting just to shoot photos anymore. I'm shooting them for a particular reason. And I think everybody should go into it shooting a photo with some reason. What is this for? Even if it's a family photo, you still know who your audience is. Usually the people in the photo are going to be happy with it. But if you show it to the rest of the family, are they going to be intrigued by it? And so you're always playing to your audience. And so that's what we do a lot of times with these photos. And as you can see here, the perfect example of too much sky on the left and not enough sky on the bottom. So you want to find a happy medium. You want to try not to cut your frame in half at the horizon. Always, give yourself a 60-40 or 70-30 law where you're either giving yourself more sky or less sky. The only reason I put a lot of sky in an image like this is because the intention was we were going to put something over it, filtering, branding, some form of marketing collateral. And then you see on the left, it's an example of a horrible site photo. You have no idea, really what's going on here. And so, you could pull back a little and put some blue sky in there, and it's going to be a much more intriguing photo for the audience.
So Michael, in that previous slide, the one where you're too close, basically, right? Not enough sky, too close. Sometimes I notice people want to get close because they don't want to have the cars or the telephone wires or power lines in their shop. What can they do for that? You
can go before the cars are in the parking lot. I mean, you have to avoid there's always going to be uncontrollables. And, you can take certain things out with Photoshop, but it gets back to the point where, I can remove all those cars, no problem. But do I want to spend 4 hours doing that? Or do I just want to go in the morning before the cars go to work and then I don't have to worry about that? And so, so you do the best you can. With June gloom, as you mentioned earlier, we have horrible light most of the day now. If you had a shoot going on, it would be almost impossible to shoot anything right now because of the gray and the drab. There's very hard to find focus, or tell a story in that kind of weather. And so that's why I'm not out shooting sites right now. I've told you, because it's just not good weather. But when the sun pops out, we take advantage of those opportunities. And so you do the best you can. And then as you shoot, you litter and litter and leaves and, some smaller things are really easy to clean up and take out in post. That's not a problem. Cars, power lines aren't that bad either. But that goes back to making sure that you frame things in the power line, later on, how easy it is to remove in Photoshop. So knowing the beginning to end process helps.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks.
Long exposures are another one that everyone likes to do. Long exposures, you're essentially just holding the shutter open for a longer period of time, anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds sometimes. Well, obviously you can't hold the camera for that long. So we use a good tripod, we weigh it down. And in something like this, I think this is a 12 to 15 second exposure. So, you're going to shoot it, not to get too technical, but we call it bracketing basically, where the camera will just naturally shoot 10 frames in a row at different shutters or different apertures, depending on how you choose it. And so it does the work for you. So you just sit back while it's on the tripod, it'll fire off the 10 images at different exposures. And then you can just look and choose the one you want. Or in something like this was for a landscape lighting company. So maybe, the trees in the background weren't dark enough. So you can overlay the images and then you just filter out, or with some transparency tools, you just drop out what you want and what you don't want. And that's the magic of long exposure photography these days.
So the key to what I heard you just say was that wasn't just the one shot and done. I got it.
No, none of our night photos, especially when it comes to landscape lighting, because going back, you don't want landscape, you don't want any kind of lighting, much less if you're the manufacturer of landscape lighting, to really blow things out. And when I say that, I mean it is so bright that you can't see any of the detail and what it's lighting up. A good landscape lighting designer like this, they keep the shadows to a minimum. They uplight the trees to the left of the barn, the barn very well, without casting huge, scary shadows on the barn itself. And so all those things come into account. And so not only is it a good lighting job, but maybe the lights underneath the deck have so much reflective light that if I hold the shutter open for 10 seconds over there, it's going to be too bright, where the trees over on the far left on the driveway need 10 seconds. And so everything in this image, because it's such a large environment, is not going to need the same amount of exposure. So I can't just put 10 seconds in the camera and hope it all works. It'd be way too bright here, way too dark here. So what we do is we bracket the exposures, overlay them, and then we go in and basically erase the bright spots. And that's where you get the detail. And that's why all the wood on the barn and the tree is also crisp, because it was shot at the ideal exposure. If I remember correctly, it was like 12 degrees in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where this was shot. So when you shoot 4 hours and you shoot 500 images, it can be a tedious process, but obviously you see the results.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
As I mentioned earlier, bending your knees is one of the biggest tricks I can tell anybody. You should never be standing upright with your camera, kind of tourist style, back straight shooting a photo. Very rarely is a photo ever going to come out as good as it could do it standing like that. And so one of the first things I tell people is to bend their knees, especially when you're shooting babies, children, shorter people, don't shoot down on them. You know, you want to at least try to be even with them, or shooting up on them a little bit, have them keep their chin up and kind of shoot up on them. But I would say 90% of the images I've shot in my life, I'm bending my knees, laying on the ground, hunched over, you know, or up on a ladder shooting down. Nothing is ever straight on, even if it's an iPhone photo. And as you can see in these, you know, I'm laying on the ground as close as possible to try to tell that story of the foreground, middle ground, and background. And, you know, it makes deciding your focal plane that much easier when you're closer to the ground, because now you have this, you know, this surface to play with. Okay, the fun stuff. So file management is a huge one. The biggest tip I can give for file management, when you're uploading photos to your computer, don't get lazy and just hit enter and let them all load as JPG.001 over and over. I know I used to do the same thing. I still do. What ends up happening, the biggest problem is not only will you just never be able to track down your photos, but as you start to move them in and out of editing software, the editing software is going to force you to rename it. And now you're going to have multiple files. You're going to have the original one that was the generic name, and now you're going to have the new one. And so this goes back to a duplication of efforts that's just unnecessary. Spend the time when you're uploading the photos. You don't have to name them individually, but at least pocket them into folders that are relevant to the topic, so you can go back and name them as you edit them. But I can tell you, one of the biggest nightmares using editing software is when things aren't named properly. Because if I try to drop an image into a brochure, for instance, and the name is changed, or the destination, or where it initially resided was, the software can't find it. And so you can't spend time moving stuff around from folder to folder, renaming it. It's just going to create a cumbersome process down the road. So the best tip I can give is name it properly the first time, and you'll never have to worry about it again.
Yeah, that's helpful. As I've built up my library, it's like I can't find stuff. So, or I spend hours trying to find it. That's really helpful.
And then, so the next question usually is, you know, what software do you use? We stick a lot to it. Adobe's got everything basically for photos that you need. I use 6 different kinds of Adobe software. I'll use Lightroom to introduce the photos from the camera to the computer. I'll use Photoshop to do more advanced editing. We use software called InDesign, which is what we build all our brochures and stuff with. So fortunately, they're all run by Adobe. So there's really good interaction between the different softwares, but you can see it can, learning one is huge because all the shortcuts typically work in the other ones. So if you have the opportunity to take a Photoshop class, take it. And then you can always figure out which software works best for you. But they're really good about the tools and the shortcuts working from software to software, I've learned. So you pick them up very easy. But the one that I would recommend right now for everybody on the call is Adobe doesn't really sell their software anymore. I mean, you don't have to pay $500 now. It's like $10 a month, and then you get to choose the different softwares that you want. And so, you know, I think we pay $50 for all of them, but you can pay $9.99. And if you're shooting enough that you don't want to use Apple Photos, you want just to use a decent lighting or a decent editing software and file management for photos, this is Adobe Lightroom. It's basically a more simplified version of Photoshop. It allows you to do editing, but not substantial editing. It's more exposure based. So you can potentially save money or use a cheaper camera to shoot maybe just a normal image and pull it into this and spend your time in this and make it look a lot better. But this is the interface for Adobe Lightroom. And finally, some final tips for how to shoot the best photos with your phone. So obviously we've reviewed a lot, anything from the different settings to subject matter to how to compose an image. But you know, it's very easy with the phone these days. Fortunately, they give us a couple different modes. The standard mode is going to be everything's in focus. This is going to be reliant on you to add any, any dynamic or any interest or appeal to the image, because it's going to be very flat. This is something we use just to kind of shoot a broken sprinkler in the ground. Portrait mode goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is a focal plane drop. And so in something like this, what it's basically doing is it's just tightening your focal plane. It's blurring out the background. And then it's also telling you how far from your subject you need to move, maybe 3 to 5 feet. And I mean, originally when iPhone tried to do it, they didn't have that feature where it told you to move. And so everyone got frustrated with it. And then they dropped it for a whole rev update. And then they came back and were like, oh, well, if we just tell people to move forward and backwards, then they'll figure it out. And everyone's figured it out now. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. You know, there's going to be some zoom on the lens. There's going to be some walking forward and backwards. And then there's going to be some moving your subject closer backwards. You know, these are all those X and Y axes that you can control. And so if you can control them, control them. And then the panoramic mode is one of the coolest things. You know, one of the tips I say for panoramic mode is, you know, move the camera back and forth a good few times. iPhone has the line across it to give you your horizontal plane that it wants you to follow. Most people that pull it out, they just pull it out and they start doing it and then it doesn't work, or it's blurry or it's crooked. Just move the camera back and forth a few times and get kind of your, you know, your pivot point off of your elbow, then do it and then move it across. And that's how I've learned to keep straight lines. And obviously only shoot a panoramic photo if a panoramic photo is due. Panoramic photos don't work very good inside. And then social media framing, we shoot in squares. So this goes back to earlier, you know, if you plan on using something for Instagram, or you know that your final medium is going to be a square, don't put the most important parts of your image on the left and the right side of the frame. So, you know, shoot according to what the end use is going to be for the image. I mean, it's so complicated here that we have a great marketing team, but you know, when we're shooting an image for Instagram, it's for image. When we're shooting an image for Facebook, it's for Facebook. You can reformat them and compress them all you want, but ultimately the odds of taking a rectangular image and a square image and the subject matter and the appeal of the image being exactly the same are very rare. And a photographer can usually tell when something's been cropped in on or out of. And I think even the layman can. I think you know, most people aren't very excited about a cropped image because they can tell the story has been compromised. So when we frame for social media, we frame in squares. And then that's it, Richard. I'm sure there's over 1,000 questions in there, so I cannot wait to hear them. But as you mentioned in the beginning, we are going to have hopefully these tips worked out for everybody. And over the next couple weeks, you know, if you could send me your best photos of anything from agriculture to the garden, something with green or something organic in it, we're going to choose a winner and give a Hero 3 out. So it's GoPro's new waterproof camera. And we're going to announce the winners on the webinar in 2 weeks, at the beginning of the webinar, because I don't know what the webinar is about. So you get to learn who the winner is at the beginning. But please send me your photos, and we're also going to run them in our running blog. So we'll run either probably the top 10 images. So you get to see your images posted, and I'll do some critiquing on them as well. So feel free to send me your images. And Richard, if you have any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, no, a really exciting contest, Michael. And for those of you who want to see more of Michael's photographs, as well as some of our other photographers from Jane, every Thursday we publish my favorite photos of the week on the website. So if you just go to the blog and you can find here are 7 of the week's best photos, you can see them all there. And it's really exciting that all of you have the opportunity to be a part of those photos too now through this contest. And gosh, who doesn't want a GoPro? So great contest, Michael. Thank you. We had a couple more questions here. And the first one is, do you post-process all your images before you post or before you publish?
So for some of the social media stuff, for like Instagram, it's usually just depending on what the promotion is. Some stuff, you know, there's a guerrilla factor to some of the social media stuff where sometimes if it's a little too over produced, it kind of loses its mystique. So there's a time and a place for every medium. And we know that more than anything with 4 or 5 social media platforms. You know, you're really shooting for the audience as well. So on Instagram, sometimes our Instagram audience just wants to see what's going on in the field, some of the different product challenges we see, or some of the different opportunities that exist out there that don't require any post-production on the images. But, you know, the stuff that's going into print ads, for sure, everything is going to be looked over with a fine-tooth comb. Any of the product stuff for catalogs, there's a lot of money in printing paper. So we're going to make sure that everything looks the best it can. I would say that 95 to 97% of the photos that I shoot, there's some post-production involved, even if it's pulling them from a raw file into Lightroom and compressing them down to a more manageable like Photoshop or JPEG file. But there's definitely always some post onto every image.
Yeah. And then for Smart Irrigation Month next week, I'm going to take a picture of my smart controller, my E2 Water smart controller, and I want to put a hashtag Smart Irrigation Month on it, on the image. How do I do that?
Oh man. So I know how to do it in the comments. I know there's different filters to do it on Instagram. I've never written on the top of an image before. I don't really know how to do that. I'm going to be honest with you. I could probably figure it out and teach you or show you how, but I don't know. I see the people do it all the time, so it can't be that difficult.
Yeah. And then what about, I'm seeing a lot and reading a lot about something called a gimbal. Do I need a gimbal to shoot photos now? Does that help? What about that?
So, so I think we paid about $150 for our gimbal. We call it Crazy Stick because sometimes they kind of get a mind of their own. This, just like moving your subject matter forward and backwards, a gimbal, ultimately it's just a series of gyros inside that are trying to hold the phone stable to the environment, the ground. And so, it can get kind of crazy, but we use a gimbal for a lot of our B-roll footage in our videos. They're just like a drone. There is a talent to it. Even the one we bought that was about $150 from a company called Smoove, SMOOVE, I think it is. And there's a little toggle stick on the handle, and then it also is going to gimbal, and there's different settings you can do for time lapse to move. So for $150, it's a great tool. I mean, I definitely recommend it. That and a reflector. These are all very cheap tools to make things look really neat. When we shoot a lot of our indoor greenhouses, we use that B-roll because the iPhone's waterproof. And so if there's sprinklers running, we can use a gimbal and walk through. But there's definitely it takes a minute to kind of figure out and finesse the controls behind it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So then the other thing is, my tripod it actually doubles as a ladder for me, right? I mean, it's so big and bulky. I feel like I could climb on it to wash windows. Of course I don't, but I could. Yeah. Are there better tripods than that? What should somebody be looking for? I want something a little bit more portable.
Yeah. So the main factor is, so height is going to be one thing. I typically carry two different tripods. I usually have one that extends from like 12 inches to 36 inches for the stuff where I would bend my knees, where I need to be on the ground. And then you would use a full size, like a 42-inch stick, which is basically like a unistick or a tripod. Where the money comes in is the lightness. They make carbon fiber, they make aluminum, Hollywood uses stainless steel. So a lot of it depends on if you're planning on traveling with it, then you want one that breaks down small enough to fit into luggage. And then you also want it to be light enough that if you're carrying it around all day, it's not super heavy. So a typical Manfrotto tripod that like I would use is about $550, $600. But this is something that you're going to be using for years. You're going to be beating up. It needs to be light. And it needs to break down. And so the technology is in the lightness of the materials. And then it's also in how small it gets, how small and how big a single tripod can get, like you said, so you're not carrying multiple tripods around. That's where the money comes in. But like I said earlier, put your money into a good tripod for sure.
Yeah. Michael, thank you so much. This was really illuminating today to learn about photography. I know everyone, when they leave here, is going to be a better photographer thanks to you. I want to thank everybody for joining us today on this Lunch and Learn. And also want to mention again, don't forget the contest, and please send your photos to Michael Derwenko. He's got his email up on the screen right now. We're going to love seeing what you send, what you shoot, and Michael's going to be the judge. And remember, he can be influenced by if there happens to be a Jane product in one of those photos, he might like that more. I don't know. I'm putting words in his mouth. So anyway, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Richard.